Driving in Florida during the late summer is a suffocating experience, even at 3 in the morning. The heat never really breaks, it just ferments in the swampy humidity. I had the AC in my Toyota Camry blasting on high, cruising down a desolate stretch of highway near the edge of the Everglades. I was just about to log off and head home when a ride request popped up. It was a premium fare, a 30-minute drive into an unincorporated part of the county. The payout was too good to ignore, so I accepted it and turned the car around. The pickup was at a 24-hour diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Standing alone under the buzzing, flickering neon sign of the parking lot was a woman. The app said her name was Evelyn. She was wearing a pale, faded yellow sundress that seemed too light for the heavy, damp night air. When she got into the back seat, she didn't smell like the diner's grease or coffee. She smelled distinctly of stagnant water and damp earth. "Evelyn?" I asked, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes," she replied. Her voice was flat, almost mechanical, devoid of any inflection. "Thank you for the ride. The night is so incredibly dark today, isn't it?" It was a strange, slightly awkward way to phrase it, but I just nodded. "Yeah, the fog is rolling in thick. We should be at your drop-off in about half an hour." She didn't say another word. She just sat perfectly still in the middle of the back seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead. I put on a low-volume podcast and focused on the dark road. As we drove further away from the city, the streetlights vanished entirely, replaced by the dense, oppressive silhouettes of hanging Spanish moss and cypress trees. Finally, my GPS instructed me to take a sharp right turn off the main highway. My headlights swept over a massive, imposing stone archway. Deeply engraved into the limestone were the words, "Cypress Hollow Estates." It looked like one of those ultra-luxurious, cookie-cutter gated communities that developers build right over reclaimed swamplands. Strangely, the heavy iron gates were wide open, and the security guard booth was completely dark and empty. I drove through the gates, the tires transitioning from rough asphalt to perfectly smooth black pavement. The neighborhood was massive. Street after street of identical sprawling gray stucco mansions with perfect manicured lawns. But something felt fundamentally wrong. There were no cars parked in any of the driveways. Not a single porch light was on. There were no street lamps, just the cold beams of my headlights cutting through the creeping swamp fog. It felt like a movie set after all the actors had gone home. A lifeless, sterile liminal space. "Take the third left," Evelyn suddenly said from the back seat, her voice startling me. It was the first time she had spoken since she got in. "It's house number 818. I followed her directions, taking the turns until we reached a cul-de-sac. I pulled up to the curb in front of 818. It was identical to every other gray house we had passed. "Here we are," I said, putting the car in park. Evelyn opened the door. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, but before she closed the door, she leaned back in and looked at me. "Thank you for the ride. The night is so incredibly dark today, isn't it?" She repeated the exact same phrase with the exact same flat intonation. Before I could respond, she shut the door and began walking slowly up the pristine concrete driveway. I swiped complete ride on my phone, put the car in drive and accelerated out of the cul-de-sac, eager to get back to the highway and civilization. My GPS loaded the exit route. In 500 feet, turn right onto Cypress Belvede. I took the right. The road curved gently. Continue for 1 mile. I drove for a few minutes, passing endless rows of dark, empty gray houses. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, pressing against the windows of the Camry. I looked at the GPS screen. It was glitching, the blue arrow spinning erratically in circles before finally settling. "Rerouting," the digital voice chirped. "Take the next left." I frowned, gripping the steering wheel. I took the left turn, expecting to see the massive stone archway of the main entrance. Instead, my headlights swept across a cul-de-sac. I hit the brakes, my heart suddenly skipping a beat as a wave of cold dread washed over me. Standing in the pale glow of my headlights was a perfectly manicured lawn, and painted in crisp, reflective black numbers on the pristine white mailbox was the number 818. I was right back where I had dropped her off. I stared at the pristine white mailbox through the windshield, my mind frantically trying to rationalize what I was seeing. 818. It was impossible. I had driven for at least 5 minutes straight down the main boulevard. I hadn't made any U-turns. I hadn't looped around. I had driven in a straight line, yet somehow the road had seamlessly curled back onto itself, spitting me right back into the exact same cul-de-sac. Just a glitch, I muttered aloud, my voice sounding thin and shaky in the quiet cabin. The GPS lost signal and I took a wrong turn in the fog, that's all. I looked down at my phone mounted on the dashboard. The Uber app was frozen. There were no signal bars in the corner of the screen, just the dreaded no service icon. Worse than that, my battery, which had been at a healthy 70% when I dropped Evelyn off, was suddenly displaying 12%. The battery icon was flashing red, bleeding power at an impossible rate. I ripped the phone off the magnetic mount, threw it onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel with sweaty hands. I didn't need a map. This was a gated community. There was only one way in and one way out. If I just kept driving and refused to take any side streets, I would eventually hit the stone archway of the main entrance. I slammed the car into reverse, backed out of the cul-de-sac, and shifted back into drive. I hit the gas pedal harder this time, pushing the Camry up to 45 miles per hour. Way too fast for a residential neighborhood, but I didn't care. The fog was so dense now that it felt like driving through milk. The identical gray stucco mansions blurred past my windows like a repeating background in a cheap cartoon. Gray house, perfect lawn, dark windows. Gray house, perfect lawn, dark windows. There was no variation, no forgotten garden hoses, no tricycles in the driveways, no distinct trees. Just endless sterile repetition. I drove for 10 straight minutes. At 45 miles per hour, I should have breached the perimeter of the neighborhood and been halfway back to the highway. But the stone archway never appeared. The road simply began to curve gently to the right. I tried to correct it, but there were no intersecting streets anymore, just a single, winding tunnel of asphalt flanked by identical houses. My headlights began to flicker, dimming dangerously low. The car's digital clock on the dashboard, which should have read something close to 3:45 a.m., was glitching. The numbers were scrambling, rapidly shifting between symbols and random digits before finally going completely black. The electrical system of the car was dying. The gentle curve of the road tightened. I tapped the brakes, slowing the car down as the fog parted to reveal a dead end. A cul-de-sac. My headlights washed over a perfectly manicured lawn, and there, glowing like a beacon in the dark, was the crisp black numbering on the white mailbox. 818. No. No. I panicked, slamming my hands against the steering wheel. I shoved the gear shift into reverse, desperate to back out again, but the engine suddenly sputtered. A horrific, grinding mechanical whine echoed from under the hood, and the dashboard lit up with every warning light simultaneously before the engine died completely. The power steering locked. The AC cut off. The headlights died, plunging the car into absolute terrifying darkness. I sat frozen in the silence, the thick, swampy heat instantly beginning to stifle the cabin. I fumbled for the door handle, thinking I needed to run, to just get out and walk into the swamp if I had to. But before my fingers could pull the latch, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. Click. It was the heavy wooden sound of a front door unlatching. I stared out the passenger window, peering through the fog toward the gray house. The front door of 818 was slowly creeping open, revealing a pitch-black interior. A figure stepped out onto the porch. It was Evelyn. She was still wearing the faded yellow sundress. She walked down the pristine concrete driveway with slow, measured mechanical steps. She didn't look at the dead headlights or the panicked driver. She walked straight to the rear passenger door of my dead car. Click. The locked door somehow opened. She slid into the back seat, bringing that suffocating smell of stagnant water and damp earth with her. The door slammed shut. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, though it was too dark to see her reflection. From the pitch-black back seat, her flat, emotionless voice echoed in the suffocating silence. "Thank you for the ride. The night is so incredibly dark today, isn't it?" I sat paralyzed in the driver's seat, the suffocating swamp heat immediately turning the dead cabin into a sauna. My breathing was shallow and ragged. In the pitch-black rearview mirror, I couldn't see Evelyn's face, but I could hear her. She wasn't breathing. There was no rustle of fabric, no shifting weight on the leather seats. She was completely, impossibly still, like a mannequin dumped into the back of my car. "Evelyn," I whispered, my voice trembling so violently I barely recognized it. "Please, how did you get back in here?" The door was locked. Silence. The heavy, damp smell of stagnant water and rotting earth grew so intense I had to pull my shirt over my nose to keep from gagging. "Thank you for the ride." Her voice suddenly cut through the dark again. Exactly the same volume, exactly the same flat, robotic cadence. "The night is so incredibly dark today, isn't it?" She was a broken record, a glitching NPC in a nightmare. My mind snapped. I couldn't stay in this metal coffin with her for another second. I grabbed the door handle, threw my shoulder against the heavy door, and tumbled out onto the wet asphalt. The thick Florida fog enveloped me instantly, sticking to my sweating skin. I didn't bother grabbing my dead phone or my keys. I just ran. I sprinted down the sidewalk, away from the cul-de-sac, my sneakers slapping loudly against the concrete. I didn't look back to see if she was following me. If the road was a loop, I reasoned frantically, then the only way to break the cycle was to get off the road entirely. I veered to the right, cutting across the perfectly manicured lawn of a dark, identical gray house. I ran past the stucco walls, heading for the backyard. My plan was to run straight through the swampy woods behind the subdivision until I hit the highway. I reached a tall, pristine white vinyl fence separating the property from the tree line. I didn't hesitate. Adrenaline fueled my muscles. I grabbed the top of the fence, hauled myself up, and blindly vaulted over to the other side. I expected to land in the muddy, tangled roots of the Florida wetlands. Instead, my boots hit solid, flat concrete with a jarring thud. I stumbled forward, scraping my hands against the ground, and looked up. My heart stopped beating. I wasn't in the swamp. I was sitting in the middle of a driveway. I slowly turned my head, the blood draining completely from my face. Standing in the fog just 10 feet away was a white mailbox with crisp, black numbers, 818. And parked at the curb, completely dark and dead, was my Toyota Camry. I had jumped over the fence of a house, moving in a straight line, and had somehow landed right back at the exact center of the nightmare. Space was folding in on itself. The architecture of reality didn't exist here. "Help!" I screamed, my voice echoing down the empty, fog-choked street. "Is anyone there? Please!" I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the front door of the house next to 818. I pounded my fists against the heavy wooden door. "Open up! Please, I need a phone!" No one answered. I pressed my face against the glass pane of the front window, cupping my hands to block out the fog. I peered into the dark living room. There was no furniture, no drywall. The house was just an empty, hollow shell held up by wooden framing. It was a prop. The entire neighborhood was just a facade. A sudden, loud clunk echoed from the street behind me. I spun around, pressing my back against the fake house. The rear passenger door of my dead Camry swung open. Evelyn stepped out into the fog, but she didn't look like the woman I had picked up at the diner anymore. Her yellow sundress was soaked and dripping with black, foul-smelling swamp water. Her skin was a pale, bloated gray, and her head was tilted at an impossible, broken angle. She began to drag her feet across the asphalt, walking slowly and deliberately toward me. "Thank you for the ride." Her voice echoed from her slack jaw, wet and distorted. "The night is so incredibly dark today, isn't it?" "Thank you for the ride." Evelyn's distorted, wet voice echoed through the thick fog. "The night is so incredibly dark today, isn't it?" I couldn't move. The primal, paralyzing terror of watching a drowned corpse casually walk toward me completely short-circuited my brain. Her bloated gray bare feet slapped against the asphalt, leaving dark, muddy footprints. With every step she took, I could hear the horrific wet popping of her broken neck shifting under the weight of her head. The overwhelming stench of rotting swamp water and decay was so suffocating that I dropped to my knees, gagging on the heavy air. The physical world had broken down. There was no running from a place that looped infinitely. The only tether to reality I had left was the car. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, tearing the skin off my palms until I reached the passenger side of my dead Camry. I threw the door open, dove inside and slammed it shut, furiously pressing down the manual lock. Outside, the footsteps stopped. I huddled in the center of the dark cabin, pulling my knees to my chest, trembling so violently my teeth rattled together. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence of the fog. Then, two wet, muddy hands slammed violently against the driver's side window. I screamed, shrinking back against the opposite door. Evelyn's face pressed against the glass. Her skin was decayed and peeling, her eyes completely milky and white. She didn't blink. She just stared blankly through the glass, her pale lips moving, repeating that same nonsensical phrase over and over again, though the thick glass muffled the sound into a terrifying wet whisper. As she stared at me, the thick Florida fog outside began to seep into the car through the air vents. It poured into the cabin like a heavy liquid, smelling of ancient mud and rotten roots. I tried to hold my breath, but the fog filled the space in seconds, burning my lungs and stinging my eyes. I felt the car begin to tilt slowly forward, as if the asphalt beneath the tires was turning into quicksand. The dark water of the swamp began to bubble up through the floorboards, soaking my shoes. The last thing I heard before the oxygen deprivation pulled me under was the sound of the glass cracking under the pressure of her dead hands. Everything went black. I woke up with a violently sudden gasp, my lungs expanding painfully as I inhaled a massive breath of hot, dry air. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my Camry. The blinding morning sun was beating through the windshield, baking the interior. My clothes were completely soaked in sweat. I scrambled to sit up, my head pounding with a severe dehydration headache, and looked frantically out the windows. There were no gray stucco houses. There was no perfectly manicured cul-de-sac. My car was parked on the muddy shoulder of the main state highway. Cars and semi-trucks were flying past me in the morning commute. Directly to my right, swallowed entirely by decades of overgrown vines, thick palmettos, and stagnant swamp water, was a rusted, collapsed iron archway. I could barely make out the faded letters carved into the crumbling stone, Cypress Hollow Estates. I threw the car door open and stumbled out onto the grass, coughing and shielding my eyes from the sun. I looked back at my car. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and dried mud, but there was no water inside. No shattered glass. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat. The battery was completely dead. I managed to flag down a passing highway patrol officer after 20 minutes of walking. I told him my car broke down and my battery died. I didn't tell him about the endless loop, the fake houses, or the drowned woman. He would have locked me in a psychiatric hold. He gave me a jump, and as the engine roared back to life, I asked him casually about the old stone archway on the side of the road. The officer looked at the overgrown ruins and shook his head. "Old real estate scam from the late 90s, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. A developer tried to build a massive luxury subdivision out here, right over unstable marshland. They finished the model homes and the roads and even had a few early buyers move in. But during a massive storm in 1998, a sinkhole opened up, swallowed the whole back half of the neighborhood, including a cul-de-sac, straight into the swamp. Took a woman with it. They abandoned the project the very next day. Place has been rotting out there ever since." I drove back to my apartment in absolute silence, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few minutes, terrified of what I might see. When I finally plugged my phone into the wall charger and turned it on, my stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. My Uber app was open. The ride for Evelyn had been marked as completed. The payout was 0.0 zeros, but it was the rating notification that ensures I will never drive near the Everglades again. She left me a 5-star review, accompanied by a single comment typed in the system. "Thank you for the ride." The night is so incredibly dark today, isn't it?